Well, good evening. Glad you're here. If you'll just get comfortable. So this is our second annual Bach lectures here. And last year we had this in the fellowship hall, for those of you that were able to join us or have seen that video. It was lots of fun. And I said to the folks today for the Psalm Tap that the idea was that we would take and give you, the general listener, something that a taste of what your students are getting, although they don't get to really interact with Mr. Hodges here. But they are getting to look at music with new eyes or listen through new ears to riff on JBJ, James B. Jordan. But it's the idea is the life of Bach is a good jump off for the 21st century church, not because we want to elevate the man to be something that he was not that he is perfect, but he gives us a type of someone that we can emulate, that we can mine from both his compositional output, his life, his practices, the struggles that he faced that are comparative to our own in this day. And I think that's something that we would do well to give thanks for. So we thought these lectures would just be, we didn't know how they would morph. But tonight you're going to hear music and you're going to hear Mr. Hodges. We originally were going to have some live music. If you remember last year we had Samantha Parker play a violin partita, a portion of that. But our cellist hurt his shoulder, and so he had to back out last evening. So thankfully he said he thinks he can play for our concert on Saturday. So tonight, here's the schedule, 6:30 here. This session will go till 7:45 with Mr. Hodges. So you will get to dig in with him. It will take a 15-minute break, and then Dr. Erb will go from 8 to 9. And then we'll do the same thing tomorrow night with this again. So let me open us with prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. John Hodges. So let's pray. Father, we thank you for the life of Bach. We thank you for the great gift of music and the example that he was to us. And we thank you that we can slowly and over time get new and surprising glimpses of his faithfulness that has been lost in some senses and forgotten in others and just outright ignored. We thank you for his faithfulness. We ask that you would raise up greater Bachs. We ask that you would bless your church where we are faithful, where we are pursuing your word and joyfully singing from that word, that we would see the church produce joyful musicians and educators and people that are like you. We ask that you would bless John as he speaks and David tonight, that this would be a time of joy and encouragement to us, a time of wonder and a time of thankfulness for both the life of Johann Sebastian Bach and also for the great gift of music. We thank you now in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, I'm going to give him all the rest of the time, so come on in, sit wherever you want to. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Mason Hodges.
Good day. Glad to see you. First of all, I want to say I admire greatly what you all are doing here. It's a very rare thing in the world to have a week of music making like you're doing, learning how to prepare and sing a concert at such levels and such talented teachers involved, and I'm grateful for the Lord's work here in your lives. We were just talking a minute before I was talking with Dr. Erb, and I said, you know, part of this is a legacy that you're going to give to your children, you young people. When you grow up and get married and have your children, this is going to be a part of your lives, you see, this kind of approach to music and to art in general and to the faith. And that's truly priceless. So I take my hat off to all of you who are doing such great things here, and I hope you will continue that work every summer. Is that me? Did I do that? Is that something I did wrong? Maybe it was the second microphone. Everybody okay? No ambulance is called or anything? Is that all right? Okay. It always is a joy to be able to talk about Johann Sebastian Bach. I can't help but look upward when I see him. You know, it's easy to sort of deify the guy in music, but frankly, every great musician in the world has done just that. Thought so highly of him that there's no way to compare him to anybody else. It's an astonishing thing. And yet, he is a man like the rest of us. He's just not like the rest of us, can I say? For example, if you know anything about the music of Mozart and Brahms and Beethoven and people like that who came after Bach, so often when they want to say something truly profound, they write a fugue like Bach. It's like they say, they look back in time and they tip their hat to the master, you see. You can go through Mozart operas and you'll find 4 and 5 part polyphony, and for a moment it sounds an awful lot like Bach. You know exactly what he's doing. Brahms does the same thing. We were talking about the Brahms Requiem today. There are a couple of movements in the Brahms Requiem when Brahms just cuts loose with a Bach-like fugue, and it's always at the moment when he's saying something the most profound. And so the echoes and the influence of J.S. Bach on the rest of the world was not just for us, it was for even the guys that came within 100 years of him. You know, of course, that Bach's music was kind of, what's the word I want? He was sort of a dinosaur by the time he died. He came, you know, he died in 1750, and we music historians list 1750 as the end of the Baroque period, precisely because that's when Bach died. I'm not kidding, that's it. Because in many ways, the new style of music, the music of the Empfindsamer Stil, they called it the Rococo period, you might say, was already up and running by the time Bach died. So in fact, his own children, his own sons, became the leaders in this new style of music. Johann Christian Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, Wilhelm Friedemann Bach. He had a lot of children that were very great composers in their own right. And he encouraged them to write in the new style. You know, yeah, sure, try that out, you know, check it out. But he continued to write in the old, heavy Baroque style, marvelous Baroque style. And by the time he died, his way of looking at music was kind of old-fashioned. It was not the popular thing anymore, you see. And as the story goes, that his wife, after he died, was in pretty bad straits financially. And she often had to go and beg around for food and so on at the butchers or the bakers or something, trying to negotiate a meal and so on, some food. Anyway, I don't know about all the negotiating, but anyway, this is what happened. They say that she went one time to the fish market, and she bought a fish, and when she got it home, she unwrapped it and found out that the paper that the fish was wrapped in was one of her husband's compositions. The number of pages of music that this man wrote in his lifetime was so astronomically high, and it was of no interest to anybody at the time of his death, really, that they were using it to wrap fish in the town. It's amazing, astonishing. But the story goes that about 100 years after he wrote the Matthew Passion, or the B minor Mass, I guess it is. It's the B minor Mass. In about 1735, he wrote the B minor Mass over several years. And in 1835, a fellow called Felix Mendelssohn, you've heard of him, I'm sure, found a copy of the Bach B minor Mass and said, this has got to be performed. And he put together a group and performed it, and suddenly Bach's music was once again a big hit. And from that point on, it's never faded away again. But for about 75 years or so, his music was old hat, it was too bothersome, too stuffy and old-fashioned. Now we know better. Well, I want to tell you a little bit about a cantata tonight. Maybe you know what a cantata is. The word cantata comes from the Italian cantare, which means what? To sing, exactly. So a cantata is something that's sung. A sonata is something that's played, an instrumental, you see. Because sonare is the word for sound, to be sounded, like the violin sounded or piano sounded. So a sonata is an instrumental piece, a cantata is a vocal piece. That's basically what they mean. Now, Bach himself wrote an awful lot of these cantatas, if you want to call them awful. There was a huge number. We think he wrote about 300 cantatas in his lifetime. And that period was between, say, 1707 and 1740, maybe, something like that. So what is that, 33 years? Imagine in 33 years to write 300 of these things. And they are meant to be, most of them anyway, he wrote some what they call secular cantatas, but almost all of them are what they call sacred cantatas. And they're meant to be played and sung in the worship service. If you know the Lutheran liturgy, the Lutheran order of worship, they have specific readings for every Sunday of the year, and those readings were what he based his cantatas on. So you have a cantata written every week for that week's service. And between about 1723 and 1727, those 4 years, he wrote 150 of them. He was churning them out once a week, every week, for that week's performance. And that's why there was so much music fluttering around, because he would frantically write this thing, rehearse it, and do it on Sunday morning, and then he had to turn around on Monday and start writing another one. And that old one just got blown to the wind sometimes. And as it turns out, of those 300 that we think he wrote, we only have about 200. So about 100 of them have been lost. A little less than 100, 93. About 93 of them have been lost. It's a terrible shame, but that's the case. He wrote so much music. My old music history teacher, I went to Indiana University, and we had a fellow there who's an old German man, and he taught us music history. And when he talked about Bach, he said this. He said, "You know that Bach wrote so much music that the historians have divided over the course of his lifetime all the bars of music that he wrote. And they've made an average, and it came out, I don't know what it came out to be, 112 bars of music every day or something." And he would say, so over the course of his 65 years, he wrote on an average 112 bars of music every day of his life. And during the first 4 or 5 days, he hardly wrote anything at all. Let me tell you a little bit about the period that he finished, that Baroque period, because it'll tell you something about the nature of the cantata. The cantata is a vocal piece. It could be for chorus, small orchestra, usually chamber orchestra. Could be for chorus, could be for soloists, could be for solo instruments too. A lot of times he would write for a trumpet or for a violin or for an oboe, some sort of like a concerto line, really. It's virtuoso playing for that instrument. And he would set the texts that were in place for that day. And sometimes he would write the actual texts, he would use the actual texts, and a lot of times he would use poems that were written by other people that are inspired by the texts for that day. So what you get sometimes is new material, new poetry that interprets the text of the day. So in a sense, you have two layers of interpretation for the text of the day. You have the poetry, instead of just the text itself, you have the poetry that refers to the text, and then you have the music that has its own language that refers to the text and to the poetry. So it's a kind of a multi-layered interpretation of what's going on. The piece we're going to listen to is his cantata number 32, and it is written for the first Sunday after Epiphany. First Sunday after Epiphany. You know, how many knows when Epiphany is? Yep? Somebody in the back there. What do you say? What's that? What's the date of Epiphany? Anybody know? January 6th. That's right. That's right. It's 12th night, isn't it? It's the 12th day after Christmas. This is where we get the 12 days of Christmas, isn't it? From Christmas Day to Epiphany is 12 days. Okay, well, this is for the first Sunday after Epiphany, after January 6th. Right. Oh, I was going to tell you about the Baroque period, though. See, maybe the greatest accomplishment of the Baroque period, the unique accomplishment of the Baroque period is called the opera. The opera is born really in about 1603, 4, 5, 6, 7, right in there. First few years of 1600s, and I think maybe they say that the first opera was Monteverdi's Orpheus and in the underworld. But the point is, music in the Renaissance, especially toward the end of the Renaissance, had gotten so complicated and multilineal, polyphonic that way, that there were certain restrictions in terms of the ability of the melody line to express anything. It was too structured and strict. And so what happens in the Baroque period is an emphasis on a sort of change of emphasis from the perfection of the form of a piece of music to the expression of the meaning of the piece of music. Can you dig that? Does that make sense to you? The Renaissance, especially composers like Josquin and Palestrina and Wiert and William Byrd, people like that, were writing pieces that had this wonderful, beautiful clarity and simple polyphony, and it was the form of it and the radiance of the harmonies and so on that were the richness of the beauty of the piece. And they are ethereal and glorious and marvelous in their own way. But the Baroque composers said, I can't live in the sort of straitjacket of that kind of form. I want to be able to write a melody that can express the feelings, the emotions of the singer, you see. Well, you can't do that with multiple parts like that. You have to sift out all of them and just have one voice singing. And so is born a thing called an aria. An aria is an air, that is, you're singing on the air. It's a melody, in other words. Well, the Baroque composers started writing arias to be expressive. They were interested in the expression of the meaning of the words, and they wanted the congregation or the audience in the opera world. It's a secular story usually in the opera world. They wanted the audience to be able to sort of relate to and empathize with and feel the experience of the singer. That's what they were after. Well, how many of you were here at the session I did last year on Bach? Yeah, a lot of you. Okay. Well, we talked about the B minor Mass, and we talked about how the setting of the Mass in Bach's hands was far more expressive than the setting I think I had a Palestrina example for you. Two very different approaches to beauty. And actually, we're going to talk a little bit more about beauty tomorrow night. Well, let me tell you a little bit about this particular cantata and why I want you to hear it. The cantata is like a mini opera. It's a way of taking the kind of espressivo, they say, expressiveness found in opera, and in using it to express religious fervor, religious feelings, empathize with the characters in a parable or in a story from the Bible, and that kind of thing. Bach was a genius at this. And this particular cantata has as its gospel text the story from Luke about how Jesus at 12 years old was lost. Do you remember? His family had gone to the temple and they were leaving, and some miles away, I guess, they realized that he wasn't with them. Oh no, right? Isn't he with you? No, he's not with me. Is he with you? No, I don't have it. And they had to turn around and go back, and sure enough, he's in the temple. And he says, didn't you expect to see me here in my Father's house doing my Father's work? That's the story. Well, there's a fellow called, George Christian. Wait, I bet I have his name here. Hold on a minute. Just a minute. I thought I jotted it down somewhere. Anyway, this is the fellow that wrote the poetry. Yeah, George Christian Lehens. That's it, Lehens, Lehens. And he wrote this poem, this poetry, in response to this story in 1711, so quite a bit earlier than Bach wrote the cantata. Maybe 20 years earlier, 15 years earlier, I guess. And Bach liked this poet, Lehens, so much, he has actually set several of Lehens' bits of poetry in these cantatas. In this one particular, he has a poem that he imagined that Mary would have sung when she finds out that Jesus is missing. And so you can imagine the angst and the fear and the concern for his well-being and so on that a mother would have, having her son disappear that way. And so the poem, let me read you the first movement of what the poem is this. Dearest Jesus, my desire, tell me where can I find you? Shall I lose you so soon and no longer sense you near me? Ah, my treasure, bring me joy, and let me embrace you with greatest delight. So that's what you're going to hear the soprano sing in a second. So what Bach did was take that poetry and write melodies and harmonies and so on that give you the sense of longing of a heart of a mother for her son. That's what you get to hear. So let me play you the beginning of it. Whoops, that's not it. That's something altogether different. Here we go. The oboe starts us off. Where can I find you? Beloved Jesus, my desire, mein Verlangen. me stop it just for a second to show you what he's doing. Do you hear how the oboe is the solo instrument to begin with, right? Before the singer comes in. Once the singer comes in, though, the oboe continues to play, but they interweave with each other. Have you seen that? Did you see it? She'll sing Mein Verlangen, and the oboe will go dee da 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 dee da 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 mein Verlangen dee da, like kind of woven together like this. You see, so the longing and the espressivo, as we say, at the beginning, built up by the oboe player, spills over into the melody that the singer is singing, the soprano, but then continues to fill out and flesh out and finish her phrases. She'll stop and he'll go along, and he'll stop and she'll carry up, pick up again and run. And so you get this sort of wovenness together. You listen to it some more, you can hear. Listen to the oboe here. Hear it? Marvelous duet. That's just the opening movement. Now, you'll notice that this piece is written for a soprano and a baritone. But you notice, too, that the baritone makes no entrance in that whole opening number. Well, there's a reason for that, because the baritone is going to play the part of Jesus. And so we have, just like in operas, we have a back and forth of two different kinds of music. What you just heard is an aria. What you're going to hear now is a recitativo, a recitative, and it is the other kind of music in the opera. It's the same way in the oratorio. The opera and the oratorio and the cantata all use these two kinds of music. The recitative is for the purposes of establishing the situation. It kind of progresses the plot along, if you will. And then the aria is for the purposes of emoting about that moment in the plot from the singer, you see. So the melodies are all in the aria, but there are clever little bits in the recitativos too. So what you're going to hear next is Jesus. And I want you to see, how old was Jesus when he was when this story went on? Do you remember? Yeah, 11, 12, something like that, right? See what you think of this. Let's see if we can.
Was ist, dass du mich gesucht?
How is it that you sought me, he says.
Weißt du nicht, dass ich sein muss in dem,
Did you not know that I would be in my Father's house?
das meines Vaters ist?
That's the recitative. Now, did that sound like an 11-year-old boy to you? No. Hold that thought. Now he's going to sing his aria. And his aria, the text for his aria is, I'll read it for you from the translation. Here in my Father's place, a troubled spirit finds me. That is, my mother. There you can surely find me in my Father's place, that is, and join your heart to me, since this is known as my dwelling. So he's going to be singing about his Father's house and about how this is the place where you can come to find me. This time it's a violin solo, isn't it?
Hier in meines Vaters Stätte, hier in meines Vaters Stätte, findet mich ein betrübter Geist. Hier in meines Vaters Stätte findet mich ein betrübter Geist.
Does this music have a different character to it than what you heard in the first movement? Quite different. There's no anxiety in this music, is there? There's no tension, harmonies, and dissonances and things. Very straightforward diatonic melodies.
Meines Vaters Stätte findet mich ein betrübter Geist. Hier in meines Vaters Stätte findet mich ein betrübter Geist. Ein betrübter Geist, ein betrübter Geist, findet mich hier in meines Vaters Stätte. Hier in meines Vaters Stätte findet mich ein betrübter Geist. Da kannst du mich sicher finden und dein Herz mit mir verbinden.
He's singing, here one finds safety and security in my Father's house. This is my dwelling place. And this kind of aria is what they call a da capo aria. Da capo.
Kannst du mich
I'll run out of time if I don't talk over it a little bit. I hate to do it, but a da capo aria is an aria that has a section that and has a finishing point, and then has a contrasting section after that. That's what you're in right now. And then a repeat sign at the end, and it goes all the way back to the beginning, to da capo. Capo means head, back to the beginning, and then stops at that midpoint. So it's kind of an A-B-A form. Does that make sense? So now we go back to the very beginning again, you see. This is typical of operas. This is typical of oratorios. This is typical of cantatas. So you can see that Bach, even though he never went very far from his home base in Germany, knew the music of all the Europeans. He's borrowing from Italian music when he writes a da capo aria. Very much aware of the kind of expressive work that people like Vivaldi were writing. Notice too that he repeats the words a lot. He doesn't just say them once. He wants you to hear them over and over again. And each repetition has its own little variation and a different, if you study them, each of them, there's usually a reason why he's written it that way for the repetition. There's no end to the study you can make of these works. Okay, well, that's our introduction to Jesus. So now we've met Mary and her anxious story, and then we hear the recitative where Jesus says, "Didn't you think I'd be in my Father's house?" And then he thinks, Father's house, I should sing about that. And he goes, "In my Father's house, I'd like to tell you all about it," that kind of thing. Well, okay, but you notice that neither of those two soloists, the soprano and the baritone, are together in the same movement, right? She sings her solo, he sings his solo bits, all's well with the world. Only, this is all about somehow getting them reunited, right? The story, after all, is about Mary not finding him, wanting to find out where he is, finding him in the temple, and being reunited. So, on to the next recit. Now you hear the soprano, and she sings, "I'm so glad to have heard about your Father's house," she says. Her recit goes like this. She says, "Ah, holy and great God, thus I will here then with you seek certain comfort and help." This is the place to be, to know you and to be helped by you. "If you will renounce earthly toys and enter this dwelling alone, then you can remain both here and there." Jesus starts to say then, quoting Psalm 84, "How lovely is thy dwelling place, O Father." So you get to hear that in German. My spirit longs for that which only in your court sparkles. It's a sort of wacky translation, but that's what they've written here. Only in my Father's house can I find these satisfactions, this beauty, this glory, this loveliness. My body and soul rejoice in the living God. And then, Jesus, my breast loves only you forever. Thus you can be happy when heart and spirit are known and inflamed with love. Inflamed with love for Jesus. This word now that already rests in my heart out of Babel's borders, she says. I hold fast in my soul devotedly. Now that you've given me this word, now that you've told me about this place, I know to stay here, you see. I want you to listen carefully to see how the two of them actually sing together, because it matters. O holy and mighty God, He's saying, renounce the world and come with me into my temple, the temple here. And then the sort of duet aria, how lovely is thy dwelling place. Lord God of hosts, I long to be in your courts. My body and my soul cry out for the living God. This is Psalm 84. My heart will love you forever. Did you hear how long she held the word A of ewiglich? Ewiglich is forever. So she's resolved to stay there. Now, before I play the next part, I want to ask you, how did they interact with each other? Did you ever, what did you hear? Exactly right. One person would sing a little while, and then the other one would sing, wouldn't it? And then back and forth, huh? Very good. Good ears. That's right. Did you ever hear them sing in harmony at the same time? No. Not yet. So here's the first interaction between Mary and Jesus, supposedly. The first interaction in the music here, poetically speaking. She speaks, and he speaks, and she speaks, and he speaks, but they're not united yet. They're not together. So listen to what happens next. And listen to the difference in the character of the music. This next aria goes like this. Now all trouble disappears. Now crying and pain dissolve. Now I will not leave you, and I also will constantly embrace you. Now my heart is content and can say full of joy, now all trouble disappears. Now crying and pain dissolve. That's the text. See. They're together. And they're rejoicing. This is rejoicing music. This is happy, bubbly contentment. You see how they each imitate the other one? There's the da capo moment. Now here's the B section. Never will I leave you again, they're saying.
Und kann voller Freude sagen,
nun vergnüget sich mein Herz.
und kann voller Freude sagen,
Nun verschwinden alle Plagen,
nun verschwindet alle Schlagen, nun verschwindet Ach und Schmerz.
And then back to the beginning again, da capo. You'll notice too that the two solo instruments, the violin and the oboe, are also playing in time together, duet together. You hear them both? So it's not just the singers that got together, it's the soloists too. It's a whole big party going on.
Verschwindet Ach und Schmerz.
And there's your da capo aria with a great resolution that the two of them have found each other and they're living happily ever after. That's basically what the piece is about, ever after. Now, let me tell you one more thing about it before I play the last movement of it. The marvel of this poetry, certainly, but especially the music, is the ability to get the congregation to feel what it is that Mary is going through. And there's a reason for that. If you follow it carefully, there's a subtle change from the story of Mary searching for Jesus into the soul searching for God. And the soprano, at first, is understood to be Mary. But after a while, all of her questions are our questions. All of her concerns are our concerns. All of her needs for connecting with God are our needs for connecting with God. Our souls longing for God, you see? And Bach did it on purpose. He wanted you to be able to relate to her and then, in a sense, take up her call. Her, where are you? Where are you? I'm anxious to be with you. I long to be with you. Like Augustine said, my heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. And now maybe it's explicable why it is that he chose to have Jesus at 12 years old played by a fully grown man singing in his lower register. Because he's not Jesus as a little boy. He's God himself. And he's responding to our call to him, where are you? He's saying, I'm here. Wouldn't you expect to see me in my Father's house? And in my Father's house, this is the beauty and the peace and the joy that you long for. And souls that are in need, come to me. Come to me, all ye who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. You see? It's that kind of idea. So the power of this is not just in it being a pretty piece of music or kind of entertaining or delightful or something like that. It's in its ability to sort of reach out and make the thing that's going on alive to you and me as we listen. It has the power to move us internally. That's great art. If it can pull that off, I think it's really great art. And of course, if it leads you in an orthodox answer to your concerns, of course, and this obviously does. So the piece is not, it's like you can't think of music as only something that you sort of use to get to say words. You know, we just, well, music is just, I heard pastors say to me sometimes, very otherwise wonderfully sound and delightful fellows that I know and love, say to me, it doesn't matter what kind of music you play in your church as long as the words are Christian, see, are biblical. And I want to say, no, you don't have any idea what you're saying. The music actually has the ability to reinforce and to open our eyes to facets of the truth of the words that we're hearing that we wouldn't necessarily get another way. It's not to say we can't get them another way, but poetry is, and I use music as poetry, I think of music as poetry, it's a poetic way, it's a metaphoric way to speak to us about what's true, you see? And that's exactly how it is that God speaks to us. He, being transcendent and omnipresent and invisible, can't possibly explain himself to us without using metaphors. He does it all the time. He calls himself the bread, or calls himself the door, or he calls himself the vine and we're the branches, or he calls himself king or shepherd, or, you know, all those things. Well, all those things are things that we know in this world. We know those things. So when he says, I'm like that, we can say, and the light bulb goes off. It's a metaphoric relationship that he has to use to explain himself to us. We only know the things of this world. He's telling us about things beyond it. Well, I think music and art in general, poetry and so on, but music in particular has the ability to open our eyes to facets of what it is that are being taught to us, like a parable, like a metaphor, like a song. does, like a psalm does. So I think the marvel of this cantata is certainly in the specifics of how he uses melodies, how he uses harmonies to give you an idea of longing. Imagine trying to get longing into a line in the oboe, and he goes da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 da, like that. So it goes dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da da da, like that, reaching up and up and up and up with that extra note each time, longing for, working toward. It's wonderful. Ti-am ta-im, ti-am ta-ram, ti-am ta-i, ti-am ta-ram. That kind of thing. Those kinds of tension-filled 16th notes in this case. There are ways to do that. But then what about the beauty and the buoyancy and the delight of his father's house? Pum, 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 dee-da-dee-doo, dum, dum, dee-da-da-da. There's something glorious and simple and elegant and noble, even noble about that theme. Pum, 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 bee. You hear the difference, right? Dee-dum, dee-um, da-dum, da-im, dee-dum, dee-o, da-dum, da. There's something tension-filled in all of that. That's how he does it. But in addition to that, he's got this spiritual aspect of it in his mind too. It's not just making an emotional plea, it's an emotional plea for a particular spiritual condition that we all share and that we can all relate to and engage with, you see, precisely because of the fact that he calls us into that story, calls us into we can relate to the pain or the anxiety of a mother looking for her child, and specifically this mother looking for her child, her son, right? But then suddenly, before we even know it, we are the one looking for God, and suddenly we feel his absence, or we long for his presence, and we're told, just come and be with me here, and this is where it's going to happen. This is how it can all work. This is how it all makes sense. Okay, well, the last movement of it is simply a good old-fashioned Lutheran chorale. For the first time, he brings the chorus in to sing a good old straightforward four-part chorale. And the words to the chorale are, it's basically the congregation's response to all that they've just heard. And it sounds like this. My God, open the gates of such grace and goodness to me. Let me at all times and in all places taste your sweetness. Love me and urge me onward so that I, as well as I can, might embrace you again and love you, and indeed now nevermore be troubled. Listen to this. You'll know the tune. And that's the end of the cantata. Imagine having that kind of work in your church service to be able to reinforce and express the text for the day. Isn't that a fantastic thing? I'll tell you one other story quick. I was doing some research about Bach some years ago, and I was reading some letters that he wrote to his pastor. And his pastor asked him a question: would you be willing to lop 10 minutes off of your cantatas? They're a little long, but only in the wintertime. Why the wintertime? Well, because they didn't have any heat in the church. And the pastor was hoping to take an entire half an hour off of the service for the congregation in the wintertime because of the cold. It was just so cold. And he said, sure, I'll be glad to do that. He was very agreeable, and so he wrote shorter cantatas in the wintertime than he did in the summer, at least in that year. But then what shocked me was how much time they wanted the service to go. The pastor wanted to take a half an hour off the service, right? He wanted to make it from 4.5 hours to 4 hours. In no heat. Imagine. And Bach wrote to it back and said, yes, he'd be happy to do that, but he wanted to know if it would be okay if he allowed his boys, because he had a boy choir, in the St. Thomas School next door to the church. And he said, would it be okay if during your sermon in the choir loft in the cold? And the pastor said, yeah, that'll be okay as long as you give them each a copy of my sermon to read while they're waiting next door. And he said, sure. And it turns out that the sermons were all written down, word for word, and read. And it always took an hour to read the sermon. That was one of the 4.5 hours, you see. That's how it went. And he wanted them to read the sermon so that they wouldn't miss it, of course. But somehow that meant somebody had to copy out that sermon because they didn't have Xerox machines, So somebody had to write out that sermon for all the kids. And maybe they wrote one or two of them and passed them around, I don't know. But it had to be read while they were sitting in the warmth. And then they could come back in and sing the rest of the service at the end. We've come a long way, haven't we? Well, anyway, that's a taste of one of the 209 or so cantatas that Bach wrote in his, that we still have, mind you. There were more than 300 of them that he wrote altogether, we think. But some of them were lost, as we said. Tomorrow night, what I'd like to do is talk to you about the nature of beauty and play some other short examples of how various composers have connected this metaphoric relationship of the choices about music with the meaning of the piece that they've written, the transcendent aspect of the piece that they've written. But in the meantime, maybe we could take a minute and answer questions if you've got any. What do you think? Anybody? Yes, sir.
That cantata played all at once in the service, or were they scattered throughout? And also, in what circumstances are cantatas performed today?
Yeah, good question. A lot of times the cantatas are done in concert halls now, aren't they? They're mostly, like I said, most of them are sacred, so they're meant to be in the church. And I suppose there are still churches that play them, but that was, maybe 25 minutes worth of music, something like that. That's a long time in a church service nowadays, to do. So, but yeah, I think they're still done sometimes. But mostly they're recordings and they're historical, performances of them. Sometimes on original instruments. The instruments of the day were quite different than the instruments we have today. So, but he asked if how often they're done now and how. Mostly in concert halls, I think. And they're built for chambers, they're small ensembles, string quartet maybe and a couple of soloists and a harpsichordist maybe or an organist and a singer or two and maybe a small chorus, small choir. So it doesn't take a lot of forces to do them. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
How long did they continue doing the church services like that? Was it after he died? Did anybody continue on with that, or did they change it?
That's a good question. That's good. I don't know exactly how long they did it after he died. I imagine there were Lutheran churches that did it all the way into the 19th century. He was a Lutheran. He was also very fond of the Pietists. So he had kind of one foot in both camps, I think. And some of the, by the way, this is off your subject, off the question, but his pietism, I think, shows through in some of these, where's this very emotional and very intimate kind of response that is wanted from the congregation. But I don't know, it's a good question. I'd have to see exactly how long services continued that way in German Lutheran churches. There were loads of cantata composers before Bach, so it was commonplace to use cantatas as a set piece in a service. And to your question, I guess, were they all done in a row? I think so, yeah. I think they were done in order like that, yeah. Not everyone was this way, mind you. Some of them had choruses throughout them and like that, too. So the congregation would maybe join in once in a while and like that. That's a good question. I'll have to look into that, ma'am. Thank you for asking. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Yes, young man in the back. Good question. That's a good question. Somehow they didn't have a furnace. They didn't have a wood stove or something in the church. He's asking why wouldn't it be warm in the church if it was warm in the school next door? But I guess they must have had a furnace or something next door to keep them warm. The boys needed to warm up. Anybody else? I'm a college professor. I can wait for questions forever. I just wait. That's okay. Sometimes they dawn on you. That's all right. Yes, sir. In the back? Did you? Oh, over here.
Yes. Now, which cantata did you say was written after Epiphany?
This one that we just played was intended for the first Sunday after Epiphany. It's number 32. Yes, indeed. Good question. Number 32. Yes, sir.
How common was it for a church to have someone who composed cantatas or music to be performed on Sunday? Or was it just certain churches had them and then the rest of them used that music?
Yeah, that's a good question. How common is it for them to have composers that would write original music for their church services? It was very common. In fact, up until Bach's death, the greatest composers in the history of the Western world were all church musicians. That's where you find them. But after Bach, strangely enough, the patronage changes and you start seeing the really great composers going to work for kings and queens and princes and duchesses and things like that. The really great composer in the beginning of the next century, I guess he was born in 1707 or so 1709, something like that. Haydn, Joseph Haydn, worked all of his life for non-church people. He was a Christian, but he didn't work for the church. Bach died in 1750. Haydn died in 1809, something like that. No, that's right. So he was born 1732 to 1809. Those are his dates, Haydn. Anyway, the point is, he worked his whole life for the Duke of Esterhazy. He didn't write for the church. And a lot of the composers actually shift over to the state as a patron, and so not as many composers are writing for the church. There were still plenty that were. But before Bach, people like Telemann, you've heard of George Philip Telemann. Anyway, he wrote, 3 times as many cantatas as Bach. Makes Bach look like a piker. But nobody plays them anymore, but they do play Bach's. I don't know what that tells you about quality over quantity. But there were plenty of other Baroque composers that did too. And his predecessors, people like Schein and Heinrich Schütz and who am I thinking of? My brain just went off, I'm sorry. Scheidt. Oh yeah, Scheidt was another one. Buxtehude, Dietrich Buxtehude. A lot of them wrote cantatas for their churches. It was commonplace in Germany. Yes, sir.
Sacred works done in the vernacular German?
The cantatas are, yes. There may be one or two that are in Latin, but not. The B minor Mass is all in Latin, but he just borrowed the Latin texts from the Mass, But no, these are all German poems and German texts, German scripture translations. Yeah, he's asking about what the language was for the cantatas. Yeah, most of it is in German. Yes, sir. Did he ask people to sing the songs? What'd you say? Yeah. Yeah. He had instrumentalists that he hired and singers that he would hire, and then he had a singing school in Leipzig in Germany. He had a school that was where the boys went to get warmed up, right next door. Had it just like this, a school attached to the church, and and it was boys. It was all boys, so all the boys sang the high parts, the ladies' parts. So he had a choir of his own, but then he would hire instrumentalists and soloists, adult soloists, sopranos and baritones like this, to come in. Yeah, the music budget for these churches had to be significant. It was a big part of their worship. Hint, hint. Yes, sir. Why does it stop there? Well, that's a good question. There's a transitional kind of time between about 1725, 1775 that we call the Rococo period. But we call the Baroque period ending in 1750, long after the beginning of this transitional Rococo, because of the fact that Bach died in 1750. He was the end. He's the great master. So when he died, that was the end of it. You don't really see what we might call classical music, truly classical music. Everybody calls this all classical, right? But this is really Baroque music you're listening to now. But the classical period starts about 1750, 1770, and you start hearing the greatest works, 1750 probably, because the greatest works of Haydn and Mozart, the early works of Haydn and Mozart, are happening around 1750, 1770. Mozart died in 1791, so he didn't last very long. He was born in 1756. 1756, Mozart was born. So, and he's the pinnacle of the classical period, I think. But he only lasted 35 years. He wrote so much music in 35 years it makes 3 or 4 other composers look bad. He just churned it out. And Haydn lived until 1809, and he was very old then, 1732 to 1809. So that's a pretty long time. That's one of the reasons they called him Papa Haydn, because he was older than everybody else when he died. And he taught Mozart and he taught Beethoven. Haydn did. But by 1820, the classical period's over. So that didn't last very long, did it? The Romantic period is taking off. Yes, ma'am. Ooh, great question. How many children did Bach have? You won't believe this. Can you guess? What would you think would be a lot of children? What would be a high number of kids to have in a family? 5? 7? What do you think? 10? Would that be a lot? Yeah, kind of? 12, maybe? Bach had 22 children. 22. Now, it was from 2 different wives. His first wife passed away. I think the first wife had 7, and the second wife had all the rest. Isn't that amazing? Second wife had 15. Actually, it was kind of sad because back then, an awful lot of young people would die before they reached 2 or 3 years old. There were a whole lot of diseases that we've kicked now that children don't have to deal with, but back then, many of his children died before they reached their 3rd birthday. And loads of mothers would die in childbirth, too. It was commonplace. By the way, that's where you get the wicked stepmother in fairy tales, because the wife would die baby would be born, but the wife would die. The husband needed a mother at home, marries someone, but it's not the relationship between the mother and the child is not biological anymore, and so they become the evil stepmother, Cinderella, that kind of thing. Anyway, he had 22 children. Can you imagine? 22. You wonder how is it he had any time to write music? Any other questions? Well, you've been very patient, and I appreciate your time. I'll see you again tomorrow night.
Well, that's just part one. Tomorrow night he starts us off. Take 15-minute break. 8 o'clock we'll start back up with Dr. Erb. He'll also be playing one of the pieces for you and taking you through it extensively. So water or bathroom break, and we'll see you right back in here at 8 o'clock.